You ditched your Dawud to come here? Of course, dude. I'd ditch any Dawud to come here. I'd ditch the wedding if that was possible. Bismillah. Okay. Bismillah, I'll get started. So we are on page 75 of the book, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. This is chapter number 5. It's called The Unseen Men. Bismillah. 30 some years ago, someone told me about a lecture that had recently been given by Sayyid Hussain Nasr. During the question and answer period, the great Orientalist Gustav von Gronebaum remarked that Nasr's talk presupposed a power structure. What was it? Nasr replied with a sparkle in his eyes. The Rijal al-Ghaib. And von Gronebaum, along with those who caught the reference, laughed. Like all good jokes, this one has an element of truth in it. Mythic truth, no doubt, but it certainly helps explain the voice of authority that often surfaces in Nasr's writings. The term Rijal al-Ghaib means literally the men of the unseen. In Sufi lore, it refers to those human beings who live consciously in the spiritual world while governing the visible world as God's representatives. Although seldom recognized by others, they alone fulfill the cosmic function of human beings. God created the universe, as the Hadith puts it, in order to be known. Among all creatures, only human beings have the capacity to know God in his full amplitude and grandeur. In their historical actuality, human beings are indefinitely diverse, and their diversity pertains to every modality of being and knowledge. It follows that some people are better at knowing God than others, just as some people are better at football than others. From the Sufi perspective, knowing God has relatively little to do with rational acumen and much to do with God's gifts to those whom he chooses as his friends, wali, or friend being the term that is commonly translated into English as saint. The Prophet, peace be upon him, reported that God says, "My friends are under my cloak. No one knows them but I." These unknown friends are precisely the men of the unseen, whether they be male or female. The Arabic word for man here has connotations not unlike those that allowed Latin vir or man to give rise to the word virtue. According to some accounts, the unseen men can be divided into two sorts. One sort, known as the men of number, Rijal al-Adad, fill a static, ever-present hierarchy, their number never changing. Some say it is 124,000, like the prophets from Adam down to Muhammad, peace be upon him. Their chief is the pole, who is the axis around whom the world revolves and the most perfect human being of the era. Outwardly, the pole may be an ordinary and unremarkable person, but inwardly, as the text put it, he holds the reign of affairs in his hands. When the pole dies, God replaces him with one of the two imams, who had been the pole's viziers, and he replaces the missing imam with one of the 4 pegs. Below the pegs stand the 7 substitutes, and below them the 12 principles. Among the men of number, one manifests the perfections of the angel Seraphil, 3 of the perfections of Michael, 5 of those of Gabriel, 7 those of the prophet Abraham, 40 those of Noah, and 300 those of Adam. The ranks of the men of number are constantly replenished as people pass on to the next world. Hey, just a quick disclaimer, these are from the weak hadith, so just people before they have a reaction, but we'll discuss later, inshallah. As for the second sort of unseen men, their number is not fixed, and they play a variety of roles according to circumstances. Most of them fall under the ruling authority of the pole, but one group, known as the solitaries, stand outside his realm. It is not clear how literally these reports are meant to be taken. No matter how we understand them, however, they speak eloquently of the intimate relation that the intellectual tradition saw between cosmos and soul. This understanding of human nature underlies Sayyid Hussain Nasr's writings and helps differentiate his perspective from the typical historical or Orientalist approaches, which tend to provide brief and superficial overviews of Islamic theology and brief descriptions of the duties and obligations imposed on the believers by the Sharia. Then they quickly get down to the real business of describing the historical vicissitudes of the Muslim community. Nasr often speaks of the loss of the traditional Islamic worldview and the havoc wreaked on the Muslim mind by scientific theories about the universe, As he points out, and as is obvious to those familiar with the contemporary situation, we are dealing with two diametrically opposed ways of looking at reality. Even if many contemporary Muslims see no contradiction between belief in the Islamic God and belief in the objective status of scientific facts, throughout the Muslim community, two basic groups of thinkers are found. One group, constantly becoming smaller, lives more or less in the traditional worldview. The other, ever on the increase, is led by engineers, doctors, and other professionals trained on the Western model. These two groups do not speak the same language, and neither has any real idea of what the other is talking about. So utterly self evident is the nature of the world to each group that they cannot imagine any other way of seeing it. The fact that they do not understand each other helps explain why contemporary Muslim preachers can exhort the young to study science and engineering, relying on prophetic sayings such as seek knowledge even unto China. They speak of science here by using the term ilm or knowledge, always recognized as the backbone of Islam. And they have no idea that science is driven by the worldview of taqdir, or that it has starkly different goals and implications from Islamic knowledge, whether of the transmitted or the intellectual sort. In several of his works, Nasser has explained the main principles of the traditional Islamic worldview. Here, I will try to reformulate certain aspects of this worldview in a language as unencumbered by the technical Islamic terminology as I can manage. My aim is to bring out the basic ideas on human nature underlying Nasser's writings, and especially his evaluation of modern thought. I offer one person's opinion that his interpretation of the contemporary implications of Islamic thought are firmly grounded in the tradition, much more so than many of his critics would like to acknowledge. The fact that he does not always cite Muslim authorities, but instead is likely to refer to Fritjof Schuon or Ananda Kumaraswamy, cannot be taken as evidence that his views do not have the Islamic support that he claims. He is not speaking as a preacher interested in bolstering his arguments by quoting the revered names, but rather as a philosopher who has found some of the clearest expositions of his own intellectual vision in contemporary authors. Nasser, of course, does not write only about Islam, but also about other religions as well. Like Schuon and Kumaraswamy, he claims universal validity for a point of view that he and they usually call traditional, and that observers have often called traditional or perennialist. This perspective asserts that human beings at all times and in all places have recognized the reality of one unique principle and received guidance from it on various levels. What makes them human is not the peculiar biological, social, and historical constraints placed on the species, but the fact that they have been given access to the infinite, the absolute. This access is given to people, which is to say that it comes from the other side and cannot be reached by self-motivated efforts. This explains the necessity of prophets, avatars, Buddhas, sages, shamans, and so on, and why the guidance must be transmitted from generation to generation. Nasser and the traditionalists never take the patently absurd position that all claims to suprahuman guidance are true, nor do they say that all forms of revealed guidance will lead to the same place. Evil and misguidance play important roles in the human situation. Nasser does offer some general principles as to how truth is to be discerned from falsehood and right from wrong, but by and large, he leaves the assessment of specific teachings to the traditions within which they are offered. What is important for him is the principle of universality of the guidance that comes from the absolute and the fact that it is always available. Sufism. One of Nasser's subtexts is the relevance of Sufism to the contemporary situation and the catastrophic results that modern day Muslims suffer by ignoring or rejecting it. For a great variety of reasons, people become suspicious at the mention of Sufism. In contemporary America, it is often associated with gullibility, sentimentality, and New Ageism. In the Islamic world over the past century, many Muslims have taken Sufism as a demonic presence that must be driven out if Islam is to enter the modern world. And today, it is anathema to fundamentalists. The fact that it is relatively few modern day Muslims have any idea of the historical role that Sufism has played, even though they are likely to have strong opinions on the topic. A colleague who teaches at Harvard recounts with amusement that a young Egyptian studying at MIT took a course with him on Al-Ghazali, who has universally been recognized as one of the greatest masters of the Islamic sciences, and who is credited with authoritatively establishing the central role of Sufism in Islam. At the end of the semester, the students submit a report on Sufism origins. This report describes the Sufism origins and its influence on Islam, its importance in 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 Islam, Sufism's origins. Sorry, just one second. Even specialists in fields like religious studies or Islamic studies will sometimes remark, oh, but he's a Sufi, meaning, you know, you do not have to take him seriously because he's a mystic. Or Sufism really has nothing to do with Islam, so don't pay attention to him. Yet for Nasser and for the grand authorities like Al-Ghazali, the diverse beliefs, practices, and institutions of Islam that are apparent to outside observers make up Islam's body, and Sufism provides this life-giving spirit. From this standpoint, Muslim modernists and fundamentalists who violently reject the Sufi tradition are trying to breathe new life into Islam's body. And this life, this life can only be drawn from alien sources. The discussion here, of course, is not about the history of the word Sufi and its derivatives, since the term came into regular use only in the 3rd/9th century, but about what Nasser and many of the great authorities of the past have understood by the term when they employ it. Although Nasser has written eloquently and persuasively about Sufism's centrality to the Islamic tradition, he cannot repeat these remarks in everything he writes. And even if he could, many observers reject this understanding of Sufism's role in Islam, so they feel no need to consider his position. Nasser has not necessarily helped his case by describing Sufism as Islamic esotericism. In this, he is presumably following Schuon and to a lesser degree Henry Corbin. Schuon has written voluminously employing the exoteric dichotomy as a key conceptual tool for understanding religion. However, not many Islamic English-speaking scholars have followed this practice, partly because few specialists have found it helpful in dealing with the actual texts. One of the problems with the word esoteric is that no matter how carefully terms may be defined, negative connotations cannot be avoided. The word is suspect by its very aura, and little can be done about it. From a linguistic point of view, one of its disadvantages is its high degree of abstraction, which results in a constricted semantic field that does not allow it to embrace the vast diversity of phenomena that have always been associated with Sufism. The restricted field becomes obvious if we compare this English word esoteric with the Arabic word batin or batini, of which it is sometimes said to be the translation. The two terms may indeed be employed in parallel ways on occasion, but batin, which derives from the term batan, meaning innards, has a concrete meaning and vast possibilities for metaphorical use. In other words, the basic meaning of batin is inner or inward, not esoteric. If it is said that Sufism emphasizes the more inward teachings of Islam, few scholars would reject it. The point is simply that Sufism's perspective contrasts with that of disciplines like jurisprudence and kalam, which emphasize the more literal and socially oriented teachings. The terms inward and outward are broad and inclusive enough so that everyone will understand an appropriate meaning without being drawn into irrelevant questions, such as elitism and occultism that are typically associated with esotericism. Both esotericism and exotericism introduce nuances and connotations that are not present in the Arabic terminology. Once Nasser and others use the words, it makes sense to criticize them for being esoterists or for supporting the views of contemporary occultists, and people quite sympathetic to Sufism have done so. So now this next chapter is called Cosmos and Soul. The cosmic role of human beings lies in the background of many of the criticisms that Nasser levels at the scientific worldview. The notion of the men of the unseen is one way of expressing some of the tradition's fundamental insights, and the ideas lying behind it can help us understand why Nasser stands where he stands. In the traditional broad-based Islamic view of things, one cannot disengage the study of the soul from cosmology. Of course, everyone recognizes that pre-modern Islamic psychology has much to do with theology, since Islam agrees with the Judeo-Christian tradition in holding that man was created in the divine image. But nowadays, the cosmic dimension of Islamic psychology is difficult to understand and easy to ignore, not least because cosmology in the West has long since been delivered over to natural science. Most contemporary Muslim thinkers, in their eagerness to prove Islam's respectability in modern terms, have ignored or attacked those Islamic teachings on the cosmos and human beings that are difficult to reconcile with the contemporary worldview. They do so by ignoring the commentarial tradition and interpreting the Quran in terms of their own immersion in ideology and scientism. Others have appealed to kalam, the most rationalistic form of Islamic theology, and the least concerned with the nature of God's ontological relationship with the universe. Kalam is polemical and voluntarist, devoted to nitpicking attacks on any form of thought that is deemed to threaten God's absolute legal authority. It asserts God's radical transcendence and argues vehemently for human responsibility before the revealed law. Educated Muslims generally see things in terms of worldview that has informed the Western tradition since the beginning of that modern period. This worldview is grounded in what Nasser calls a sensualist and empirical epistemology, and its net result has been the reification and the objectification of the cosmos. The world and all its contents, including human beings in most of their roles, have been turned into isolated objects standing in ontological, spiritual, and moral vacuums. In the West, ecologists of various stripes have attempted to show the short sightedness of current conceptions of the world, usually in terms of an enlightened self interest. Some have gone so far as to propose alternative cosmologies, but these are almost always scientific, quote unquote, in that they take for granted the necessity for empirical verification and the non existence of any truly transcendent dimension to reality. Or they simply accept the theories of modern science at face value and try to construct a new scientific mythology, which will somehow restore wonder and respect to human observers of the world. Still others have recognized the need to recapture transcendence, and in trying to do so, have cobbled together diverse notions from science and various traditional worldviews with the hope that they can come up with a softened and sensitized scientific mindset. Nasser's critique of scientism and technology is rooted in the understanding that science, standing on its own, cannot conceive of what it means to be human. Many serious scientists, at least, are aware of these limitations, but not the scientific popularizers, who have the most effect on how people perceive the world. As long as the truncated worldview of scientism remains the arbiter, no opening to the infinite is possible. At best, people will devise an ersatz cosmology that hardly lets them see beyond the horizons of popular culture. Naming reality. There are many versions of Islamic cosmology, few of which have been studied in modern times. Common to all of them is Tawheed, the axiom that there is one supreme principle, an ultimately unnameable and unknowable principle, and that everything in existence appears from it and returns to it. Different schools of thought discuss the modality of appearance employing a variety of terminology, such as divine fiat, creation, and emanation. Once we recognize that the ultimate principle is there, it can be given various names, with the reservation that the names do not necessarily help us to understand the named in itself, in its very essence. Kun zatihi. Nonetheless, naming the principle is a necessary stage in coming to understand its implications for the human situation. And truly efficacious naming, that is, efficacious in terms of the full reality of what it means to be human, comes from the principle itself. Naming has repercussions by nature. When we name something, we situate it in a pre existent view of reality that allows the name to have meaning. We deal with things in terms of the names that we give to them. If we name something a chair, we sit on it. And if we name it firewood, we burn it. The Islamic tradition, like other traditions, names the world and its diverse contents in ways that let people see the function and role of human beings. This is conceived of in terms of the divine compassion that has brought the universe into being in the first place. The Quran tells us that God taught Adam all the names, a verse that epitomizes Islam's theology, cosmology, and spiritual psychology. It alerts us to the three basic realities that must be taken into account if we are to understand the nature of things: God, cosmos, and the soul. God taught the name of all of these to human beings at their origin. The names were in no way divorced from their meanings. That is, the realities named by the names. Rather, the names were the perfect expressions of Adam's realization of all knowledge in the depth of his soul. This is Rumi's point in these verses. The father of mankind, the Lord of he taught the names, had 100,000 sciences in every vein. The name of everything as it is until its end was given to his soul. Whatever title God never gave never changed. The one he called quick did not become slow. For us, the name of each thing is its appearance. For the Creator, the name of each is its inner mystery. Adam's eyes saw with a pure light, so the spirit and mystery of the names became plain to him. As the first prophet, Adam is the primordial recipient of divine guidance and the leader of all his children on the road to salvation and realization. If his children are to deal with the cosmos properly and appropriately according to the haqq of things, and if they are to actualize the fullness of their own nature, tahqiq, they need to understand the names revealed to their father and act accordingly. Human beings will always name things because they are, by definition, talking animals. Hayawan natiq. This expression is usually translated as rational animals, in keeping with the way the ancient Greek expression entered English. But the Arabic natiq or talking highlights an important nuance of the Greek. Human rationality is articulate, uttered, spoken, and proper human speech is intelligent and rational. In the Islamic worldview, the full actualization of this spoken, articulate rationality presupposes knowledge of the real names of things. Knowing the real names means knowing things in the context of God's knowledge of them, which only comes to us when He Himself names them for us. If people fail to name things under the wing of divine guidance, they will name them as they see fit. There is no possible way, however, for them to know the real names of things without assistance from the divine namer, because the real names are the realities of things in the divine mind. God gives existence to the things according to their names, and understanding their real names is the key to understanding cosmos and soul. A worldview that leaves out the divine dimension will necessarily deal with inadequate names, if not misnomers. The net result of misguided naming will be disaster for those who employ the names, if not for humanity as a whole, a disaster that is understood in terms of the full extension of the human realm, not just the world this side of that. To understand why modern scientific cosmology appears to the intellectual tradition as enormously truncated, it is sufficient to meditate on the names that science gives to the really significant things, the mysterious principles or realities that determine the configuration of the real world. What happens when the important names are quasars, quarks, muons, black holes, and big bangs? What is the psychological and spiritual fruit of naming ultimate things with mathematical formulae? The basic characteristic of mathematics that is nowadays deemed capable of expressing the nature of things with authority is its abstraction, its abstruseness, its reconditeness, the fact that only a tiny elite are able to grasp its significance and explain it to the commoners. The more the experts learn of the ultimate mysteries of the scientific universe and reduce it to mathematical formulae, the more they find that it is impersonal, unintelligible to the commoners, and arbitrary. The cosmos, the hard-nosed scientist tells us, is inhuman, and human beings are an oddity, a cosmic accident. The trickle-down effect of this worldview is palpable in modern culture. Appleyard sums it up nicely in his analysis of liberal man, the enlightened individual whom our progressive thinkers hold up as the ideal. Unable to create a solidity for himself, liberal man lapses into a form of spiritual fatigue, a state of apathy in which he decides such wider, grander questions are hardly worth addressing. The symptoms of this lethargy are all about us. The pessimism, anguish, skepticism, and despair of so much of the 20th century art and literature are expressions of the fact that there is nothing big worth talking about anymore. There is no meaning to be elucidated. Islamic cosmology begins with the knowledge that the universe holds the keys to the immortality of the souls. It views the cosmos as instilled with meaning and purpose. It names the one origin of the cosmos with a variety of names derived from the divine self naming. None of these names is abstract or inhuman. The Islamic God is anthropomorphic because the Islamic human is theopomorphic. If God is understood in man's image, it is because man was created in God's image. Unless God is understood in human terms, a yawning gap will remain between the ultimate and the here and now. Religio, or tying back to God, is impossible without images of God or imagining God. People need to take an active role in tying themselves back to God, and they can only do so in terms of themselves and their own understanding. They can understand only what they are. If they do not display the traces of the divine in some way, they cannot tie themselves back to divinity. People who live in a traditional anthropomorphic universe will necessarily deal with it in human terms. Those who live in an abstract universe will deal with things and others as abstractions. Those who live in a mechanistic universe will treat everything as a machine. Those who find the universe cold and uncaring will reciprocate. It is true that Kalam and some forms of Islamic philosophy assert God's absolute transcendence and claim that the names of God should not be understood in human terms. This perspective is necessary because it helps preserve the understanding that things begin with God, not with us. As Ibn Arabi frequently tells us, the proper role of rational thought is precisely to assert and maintain the transcendence of the One. But the mythic imagination also has its rights, for the real is in fact with you wherever you are, as the Quran puts it, Quran 57, verse 4. The anthropomorphism of the intellectual tradition results from seeing with both eyes, the eye of reason and the eye of imagination. It is not the crude sort that we hear about in the unsympathetic accounts of polytheistic worldviews, but rather the recognition of the mercy, goodness, and wisdom that prevail reality, whether or not we grasp how these qualities are present in any given circumstance. Although the Quran's description of God is far from that of the polytheistic myth, in the Hindu or Greek sense, it is certainly polynomial. The Quranic names of God, enacted and performed in the diverse modalities of ritual and praxis, determine the traditional Muslim mindset, far more than the abstractions of the Kalam experts or the rules and regulations of the legal scholars. To the extent that Muslims put the religion into practice and assimilate the Quran's teachings, they cannot fail to see God's wisdom in the signs and phenomena of the universe and the self, just as they see it in the signs and phenomena that are the verses of the Quran. Muslim praxis is studded with the divine names. Every significant act begins with a formula that epitomizes more than any other the Muslim understanding of God and his relationship with creation. In the name of God, the All Merciful, Ever Merciful. God deals with the universe in terms of his own names, and his primary names assert his universal mercy and compassion. Every prayer, every supplication, every act of remembrance, dhikr, is highlighted by divine names. And every rational attempt to understand these names is propelled by the intuition that God lies infinitely beyond human conceptualization. God gives and he takes away. He gives the names through his revelations, and he takes away our understanding of them through our attempts to understand them. The more we try to grasp their significance, the more they turn us back to the unknowability of God in himself. These are the two movements of the divine and the human, descent and ascent, origin and return, revelation and concealment, disclosure and curtaining. They mark a creative dynamic in Islamic culture that has totally disappeared in the monolithic thinking of Muslim modernists and ideologues. Muslims who practice the Prophet, peace be upon him, Sunnah, and live in the Quranic universe cannot help but think of the cosmos and soul in terms of the divine, revealed divine names. These are not strictly personal names, nor are they impersonal. God is alive, knowing, desiring, powerful, speaking, hearing, seeing, creator, life giver, death giver, forgiving, pardoning, avenger, bestower, withholder, and so on. The names of the ultimate reality establish the meaning and significance of what people encounter in the signs. The universe is imbued with purpose, and the individual instances of its purpose become clear when situations are understood in terms of the divine attributes that become manifest through them. Not that this is easy. How can we be sure if an instance of our happiness displays God's mercy or his wrath, his compassion or his vengeance? We have no way of knowing the final outcome of affairs. Traditional Muslims are confident, however, that things will work out for the best. no matter how badly they may go in any given situation. In the name of God, the All Merciful, the Ever Merciful, announces all phenomena of the universe. The Quran says that God's mercy embraces all things. Quran 7, Ayah 156. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, added a subtlety to the point with his famous saying, God's mercy takes precedence over his wrath. This is an ontological and cosmic precedent, and it means that all is well in the divine scheme of things. It follows that, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, put it, the believer is fine in every situation. The Quran repeatedly commands the believers to have trust in God, and the attitude of trust in God's mercy infuses the traditional worldview. Ideologues and fundamentalists ask Muslims to trust instead in utopian dreaming, military technology, and centrally planned coercive application of the Sharia. Then alone, they tell us, will Islam be put back in the driver's seat of history where it belongs. They never question the legitimacy of the impersonal view of reality that has allowed science and engineering to dominate people's understanding of the world in the first place. That's the end for the reading for today.